foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. If you'd like to join our conversation today at any point, 1-800-351-1212. One of the individuals whose article we've posted here is John Smirek. He was not able to join us, but I thought I'd just read a little bit from his commentary for a minute and then move on to some other issues, because we have a lot to cover today. First of all, we were talking about the climate change issue, and we'll give you a little bit of a perspective on that. We do have a word now as to whether or not the Supreme Court is going to hear this case involving Monica Sterling, who was the Marine who you might remember actually posted a verse from the book of Isaiah on her computer. We also have a little more information about this 25-year-old government contractor who actually has now been charged with leaking top secret information. So we'll get into that. Of course, this is during the month of Ramadan. We'll talk about why, in the midst of what is supposed to be one of the more holy months, perhaps the most holy month for Muslims, we have seen so many violent actions, and we'll get into some of that. And also the issue is Islamic extremism, and that will be just for starters. We'll get into a couple of other topics, and a little bit later we're going to be talking in the second hour with Dr. Everett Piper, who, by the way, is the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University and also the author of a number of great commentaries. One in particular we're going to have some fun with. This is not a daycare, it's a university. Also has been speaking on this issue of whether or not we are now allowing reverse racism on college campuses. We'll get into some of that. And then we'll finish off the day with Jay Richards. Dr. Jay Richards has been on the program with us many times before. And we spent some time talking with him about various economic issues, about how to think about economics from a biblical point of view. And since Sunday was Pentecost Sunday, he's once again had some people say, well, shouldn't we just follow the same procedures that you had in the first century? As a matter of fact, doesn't really the Bible endorse communism or socialism? So we'll have some fun talking with him as well. As I mentioned, John Smirek's article is the first one we've posted here. It's entitled, Forget the Paris Accords, Climate is Socially Constructed Like Sex. Now, he's having a little bit of fun at everybody's expense, but I think it really is good because he says the weeping and gnashing of teeth over President Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords was deafening. He said, I could barely hear my beagles baying at terrified skateboarders as they were chasing down Commerce Street. But nevertheless, he talked about the fact that there are all sorts of comments that have been made about this has ruined the future, this is the end of the planet, and on and on. You've heard so many different arguments along that line. But he said all the usual suspects are howling that Trump has chosen corporate greed and profits over the planet, Mother Earth, and hopes and dreams of our grandchildren. And so he goes into some comments about that as well. But this is where John Smirek kind of sticks his tongue in his cheek for just a minute, has a little bit of fun at everybody's expense, because he says, I'm genuinely puzzled over why progressives find Donald Trump's decision so frightening. Are they trapped in the barren patriarchal paradigm of scientific objectivity, still mired in biological determinism? If so, climate change is the only field that they feel so constrained, because what he's reminding us of is that we have this mindset on campus, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as the day unfolds, that says, really truth is socially constructed. This is why we live in this kind of world that we call almost a post-truth culture. We've been talking about here on Point of View, rebuilding truth in a post-truth culture, because there's this mindset that there's no real fixed truth, there's no absolute truth, there's certainly no absolute moral standards. And so as a result, he says, we've learned from these pioneering intellectual movements a long list of what he calls surprising and hopeful facts. First, that male and female aren't biological realities. They're merely social constructs. We can divide and subdivide and combine and conflate, even shift them at a moment's notice. He goes on to say, that women can father children, that men can breastfeed, that human life begins at the moment a pregnant mom posts her ultrasound on Facebook, that heterosexuality isn't the default sexual behavior that describes breeding. It's an artificial model. Age isn't a biological marker, but another mental defect. Hence, men can become 6-year-old girls. Of course, that's alluding back to one of those bizarre interviews that we've talked about here before, here on Point of View. And that species is not just arbitrary and discriminatory, it's outright imaginative. And so what he's saying is that if you took the same kind of mindset that is being used right now to redefine gender, sex, sexual roles, sexual orientation, all the other things that sometimes we talk about, and applied any of that to the whole question of the Paris Climate Accords or the issue of even climate change, you would really be sort of saying, wait a minute, I mean, we shouldn't be all that upset about this because reality is only what I want it to be and only what I think it is. And, of course, we can't live in that worldview, and that's one of the reasons why I think it is really important to understand that many of these ideas that are being promoted right now on college campuses that are kind of the intellectual fad, if you will, are nothing more than self-defeating propositions. But let me go on real quickly, because then he goes on, he says, if transgender theory can set us free from all those arbitrary categories, why can't it save the climate? The gross raw product of biological sex gives way to the wishes of individuals. Bruce Jenner was already a female even before the surgeon was finished with him. Likewise, the global temperature can be whatever we want it to be. If we decide as a global community to identify as a planet with a lower temperature, after all, who can judge us? You can see he's having a lot of fun with this. And so then he comes on to talk about the idea that since we have transgenderism, why don't we have transclimatism, the kind of the new frontier, and begin to redefine all of these ideas? So he's obviously looking at the issue of climate change, but also reminding us that if we applied any of the ideas that have such very significant convictions on the college campus today and have so many adherents, we wouldn't even be bothered about the idea of climate change. And of course, that's not the case. Stephen Moore, in his piece, Climate Change Hypocrites, talks about the fact that perhaps the most laughable reaction to the president's pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord came from European and Chinese leaders who blasted Donald Trump and America for, quote, surrendering its world leadership role. And he goes on to talk about how some of the leaders that said that they were going to continue to move full speed ahead on clean energy. And he said, go ahead, be my guest. But he said, we've seen this movie before. And before we take a break, I thought we'd mention that. The Europeans were all in on the Kyoto Protocol, that comes from Kyoto, Japan. Back in 2005, an international treaty the United States rejected. Those in Europe promised a massive shift to green energy and to abandon fossil fuels to dramatically reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But guess what? The green revolution was a bust. None of these countries came close to meeting those targets. Now those nations, especially Germany, are moving away from some of the clean energy sources. And they now say that they are committed to a new treaty. But if they violated the last one, why would we believe them now? The one thing Stephen Moore pointed out is even though the United States pulled out of the Kyoto Treaty and never really abided by it, it actually was the one country that met those targets, just in some respects because of a free market. So it is interesting that signing your name on a treaty doesn't mean that you're going to meet those targets. But sometimes using the free market and various kinds of engineering innovation, sometimes you can. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversations and also take your phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Andrew McCarthy begins his commentary with these words. During the Obama years, the National Security Agency intentionally and routinely intercepted and reviewed communications of American citizens in violation of the Constitution and of court-ordered guidelines implemented pursuant to federal law. This claim is backed up by a FISA court opinion and investigative research that had been done over the last 5 months. There are two problems. The first is incidental collection of data from Americans that occurs when intelligence agencies target one suspect and pick up information from an American citizen. But that is a small problem compared to what is called upstream collection of information. Andrew McCarthy explains that it is not possible to capture a single email related to a single target, so the NSA must capture packets of email data, which includes lots of emails besides the targeted email. That means your communications are being seized and subjected to inspection without any warrant or probable cause. You might think this isn't a problem since you aren't calling or writing to anyone who would be a potential terrorist or criminal suspect, but that doesn't mean that your communication won't be accessed and analyzed. Not only do the intelligence agencies look for communication to and from a target, they also look for communication about a target. Again, this is done without a warrant or probable cause. I can remember telling my radio listeners during the years when President Bush was in office not to be concerned about intelligence agencies listening to your phone calls or reading your emails. I assured them that they were looking for terrorists and criminals and would not be monitoring your communications. Well, it turns out that at least during the Obama administration, that illegal surveillance has been taking place. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just finish this off for another minute or two. Stephen Moore has been on the program with us before. He's been with the Wall Street Journal and a variety of other organizations. And I just thought for one more minute, I might read from some of his comments on climate change hypocrites, in which he pointed out that the Europeans were in the Kyoto Protocol and had difficulty meeting the targets. The United States decided to get out of it and did much better at meeting many of those targets. And what he said is it's even more amazing and underreported as the United States, even though we did not make a pledge to reduce our greenhouse gases in accord with the treaty, has reduced its carbon emissions more than some of the European signatories. He said, contrary to the flood of insults directed at the Trump administration, the U.S. is not a bad actor on the world stage when it comes to environmental protection. We are the world leader in environmental stewardship, and our energy use as a share of the economy continues to shrink. And he says even more preposterous was the claim that China, the largest polluter by far, and India are moving away from fossil fuels and transitioning to wind and solar power. He says, no, they are not. Here's what the Wall Street Journal reported in a November story about China and India doubling down on fossil fuel use. And that is, quote, China's government said it would raise coal power capacities by as much as 20% by 2020, ensuring a continuing strong role for the commodity in the country's energy sector, despite a pledge to bring down pollution levels. And in a new 5-year plan for electricity, the National Energy Administration said it would raise coal-fired power capacity from about 900 gigawatts last year to a high of 1,100 gigawatts by 2020. He said, so he's going to say, wait, we're going to be lectured by these nations about saving the planet. If nothing else, he goes into some more points about those issues. And so I thought it would be helpful, since we now have a chance to talk for just a few minutes with John Smirek, again, senior editor for The Stream, individual who graduated from Yale University, also has his PhD in English from Louisiana State University. And we've posted, of course, his first article here Forget the Paris Accords. Climate is socially constructed like sex. John, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thanks. Sorry for the delay. I was getting a medical procedure and it just went long.
That's okay. One of the things we did was read part of your commentary, and I think it's a great way to kind of connect the fact that if you use the same kind of mindset that is used when we on college campuses today hear people talk about sex or gender or sexual orientation, if you applied that same kind of mindset to the climate, then why should we be concerned? Because we can just set the climate to whatever temperature we want it to be. Your thoughts?
That's right. If Bruce Jenner was a woman the moment he decided he was a woman, and if the professor who recently wrote that he now identifies as a hippopotamus, if we have to treat him as a hippopotamus, well, then the climate must, changes whenever we say it does. If you ever saw the movie Spinal Tap, we could just set the amplifier to go to 11. Now, obviously that's absurd if the climate is, in fact, objectively getting hotter and it's going to cause problems for us. But again, that objective reality is something the left has rejected. They say that men can breastfeed, men can menstruate. By that they mean a woman pretending to be a man because of a psychological disorder called gender dysphoria identifies as a man, and you have to call her a man. You have to call biologically male people who have been castrated, you have to pretend that they're women instead of what they are, which is eunuchs or disfigured people. It's tragic. I don't mean to make fun of people who have this mental illness. I want to make fun of the pseudo-intellectuals who try to turn it into reality, and the surgeons and psychiatrists who are committing malpractice by mutilating people's bodies to match their psychological disorders.
One of the things that you hear so often, especially in this climate debate, is that those individuals, and we'll just use President Trump for the moment, so President Trump and others who are like him deny science. But let's come back to the point you're just making a minute ago. If I take seriously science, science tells me there's just two genders, male and female. Science tells me that life begins at conception, not when a woman decides to post a picture from her ultrasound on Facebook, as you talk about. So if anybody would be the science-affirming individuals, it would be those of us that are pro-life, pro-family, traditional marriage type of Christians, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. It's a matter of we respect the created order. And these people treat it like silly putty to be molded to match their individual whims. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's novel, That Hideous Strength. These the cabal of just diabolical scientists decide to remake reality to suit their fantasies. It's all part of an attack on creation. It is literally diabolical. Satan envies God as creator and wants to destroy the creation or create a counterfeit creation and get us to believe that it is real. Now, if climate really were becoming a problem, and we decided to do something about it, if we were to imitate the liberals, what they do when someone has gender dysphoria, they cut up their body to match their fantasies. If we were to follow their example, we would just put particles in the upper atmosphere to reduce the amount of sunlight. We could make the climate match the temperature that we want it to be, but it would require major interventions which might have side effects, just like sex change surgery, just like giving puberty-blocking hormones to children. The left is willing to mutilate human ecology, but they want us to treat the non-sentient Earth with all the respect that actually the human body, as the image of God, deserves.
One of the terms you came up with, again, placing your tongue really firmly in your cheek, having fun at their expense, is this idea of transclimatism, and that you, again, could make the climate anything you want just by a whim. And isn't that the difficulty we're having right now with some of these debates, especially on college campuses, because your propositions and the statements are sort of self-defeating at their very core, aren't they?
Well, yeah, they reject any foundation for reasoning, any foundation for argument. Reason, biology, long ago they gave up on tradition or scripture, but now they violently resent the idea that there's anything in objective reality at all that resists their whims. It is the bratty 2-year-old in the body of an adult professor in a tweed jacket.
Just before we take a break, since we only had you on for a few minutes, let's talk about what's available at the stream, because this is one of many columns. Matter of fact, in about an hour, I'll be also talking with one of your colleagues, Dr. Jay Richards, because he wrote a piece that came out on Pentecost Sunday, because so often during that period of time, people start looking at the first century, they look at Pentecost, they see that Christians held all of their possessions in common and say, well, that then argues that the early church was communist, or at the very least socialist. So we'll be talking with him. And of course, that article comes from the stream as well. But your article and his both come from the stream. So talk about that, because as a senior editor, I know that you've tried to really help us read some of the best and brightest Christian commentators around the country.
That's right. We try to get opinion, news, analysis from people with genuine expertise. Right now, there's a great piece up there on the front page of stream.org about how Syrian Christians and the Kurds together are about to conquer the city of Raqqa, which is ISIS's capital. The mainstream media is not talking about how Syrian Christians are actually setting themselves free and fighting for their own religious freedom with the help of the Kurds. And they are the ones who are going to defeat ISIS. That's a piece at stream.org that's up there today. Again, you're not going to hear that story told anywhere else.
Well, again, some great resources. And John, I know you were busy getting a medical procedure. We'll get you back on here again, and I just appreciate you, taking some time.
I'm sorry about that.
Okay, well, very good. John Smirik with us, and as I mentioned, just in a few minutes, we will a little bit later be talking, first of all, with Dr. Everett Piper, who is the president as well of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and then about an hour from now, we'll be talking with Dr. Jay Richards. So lots of things to cover, and when we come back, I want to give you an update on that potential Supreme Court case about Monica Sterling, the U.S. Marine convicted at a court-martial for refusing to remove a Bible verse from her workstation. So we'll talk about that. We'll get into a couple of other issues. We know a little bit more about this 25-year-old government contractor, and so we'll talk about that. And, of course, most importantly, if you'd like to join our conversation today, that number, 1-800-351-1212. And don't forget that Wednesday, that will be tomorrow, we'll get into a little bit more of this idea of things which are socially constructed, because we'll have our Millennial Roundtable and talk about some of the things happening on campus. I've already posted some of the articles that we'll be using there. Bernard Goldberg refers to the cowards of academia. Another piece by William McGurn, Why Elites Hate Us, and then also a piece by Senator Ben Sass from his book. So those would be a few things we'll be talking about tomorrow. But if you'd like to talk with us and share your comments, 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and get into a couple of other issues related to everything from religious liberty to this war on terror. We have a lot to cover, and we'll do so right after these messages.
Sarita is a Point of View listener in Georgia, someone probably a lot like you. Listening to your program, she writes, has helped me realize that I do have the power to conduct change in my area and this nation. And with all of the online tools you provide, this power has become even more apparent to me. What can one person do? A whole lot, says Sarita. And then she says, and together we can get even more done. She's right. Sarita is right. This is a moment of opportunity, and together with you, Point of View is looking to accomplish a lot. This program and those online tools she mentioned will only continue being available if we hear from people like you this week. Join Truth Team 360. There are many levels. Check them out. Choose the size of the part you can play at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you an update on a couple of stories. One that we've been following for months, and you are very familiar with it if you've listened to this program, and that is there has been an attempt to get the Supreme Court to hear the case of Lance Corporal Monica Sterling. You might remember the conversation we've had with Kelly Shackelford and with Michael Berry and others about this woman, a U.S. Marine, convicted at a court-martial for refusing to remove just an inspirational Bible verse from her workstation. It was a verse out of the book of Isaiah. And they thought that this would be a very important case, first to take to the highest court in the land in the military. But that did not go as well as they had hoped that it might. And so the other hope was to take this to the Supreme Court. Well, we found out yesterday from Kelly Shackelford at First Liberty that the court decided not to review the case. This is a surprise if you would ask me, and I'm sure when we have Kelly on or somebody that is with First Liberty on, they'll probably tell you the same thing. Because one of the things you learn about the Supreme Court is it takes 4 justices to take a case and 5, of course, to win it. You know, you can win 5-4, but you don't need a majority of the justices to take a case. Well, this is one where just taking even 4 of the conservatives, you would think they might take the case. But this was one that was even more interesting because, as we pointed out, there was a previous case back in the 1980s, which was one that then a person actually on the circuit court at that time, who now is a Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is Jewish, actually felt that this particular case would be important to take. And so there seemed like you had probably 5, maybe even 6 individuals on the court that you would have thought might have wanted to hear this case. Well, Kelly Shackelford said, if nothing else, since the court did not review the case, the travesty committed below by the Court of Appeals for the Armed Services will now stand. He goes on to say that the military court's outrageous decision means federal judges and military officials can strip our service members of their constitutional rights just because they don't think someone's religious beliefs are important enough to be protected. Our service members deserve better. And again, the issue was that she quotes from Isaiah 54, verse 17, no weapon formed against me shall prosper. And it's just sort of a paraphrase, if you will, of an inspirational Bible verse. She had it posted on her workspace. Her supervisor removed it, threw it in the trash. But you posted it again, and she was court-martialed. And first of all, that seems like an overreaction, but it also, I think, illustrates a bigger issue, one that I'd love to talk about maybe in the future with Michael Berry, because if indeed you don't have any religious rights at all in the military, and I recognize you do in a sense give up a lot of rights when you serve in the military. Figured that out, got that, understand that. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that your religious rights in some areas certainly would be appropriate. And after a trial court ruled against Monica Sterling, she appealed to the Navy Corps Court of Criminal Appeals, but that particular court also ruled against her, and that's when First Liberty stepped in and appealed the case to the Court of Appeals for Armed Forces, the highest military court, and that was a year ago when they ruled against her, denying her constitutional right to religious freedom. So I would love to hear from some of you in the military. We've, over the last few months and years, talked about how there has been what seems to be almost an assault on the religious rights of individuals who serve in the military. There seems to be a fair amount of criticism of those who actually are religiously based, which would be like our chaplains. And so this is not a ruling that is favorable. And again, it wasn't that they ruled against her. They just simply chose not to decide, which is something the Supreme Court has done quite often, in which they will wait for a better case or they'll look for other opportunities to establish a precedent. But I don't know of any other military case that's coming along that would be a better case than this one to take. So many of you have been asking what happened to Monica Sterling. Well, she was court-martialed, and the case essentially is over since it did not go to the Supreme Court. Let me change topics slightly and still focus on some of the military issues, because we now know a little bit more about this 25-year-old government contractor. Her name is Reality Lee Winner. That really is her name, okay? Okay, anyway, Ms. Winner has been arrested and was charged by the Justice Department for illegally handling and leaking top secret information, in particular national security information. We see that now, since February, when she took her job as an individual that was really with a contractor that works with the military, she had a job that had top secret clearance, and she has been working at Fort Gordon in Augusta, Georgia. So I'd love to hear from some of our listeners there as well. Perhaps they know more about this particular case, because it certainly took place there. She is alleged to have copied a classified top secret document from the National Security Agency on May 9th and then send it to what is called The Intercept. This is a published report that has actually released some of this information. The document in particular revealed that Russia had made attempts at hacking U.S. voting systems prior to the election. No real surprise, something that people have been talking about before, but nevertheless, now we have the understanding of at least where some of that information since the election came from, but there's certainly a lot that needs to be investigated and will be investigated in the House Intelligence Committee and other places. But this is a statement from the Department of Justice. Winner, again, that's her last name, admitted intentionally identifying and printing the classified intelligence reporting at issue despite not having a need to know, and with knowledge that the intelligence reporting was classified. Winner further admitted removing the classified intelligence reporting from her office space, retaining it, and mailing it from her Augusta, Georgia location to the news outlet, which she knew was not authorized to receive or possess the document. So, again, we have a pretty good understanding of what she did. We also have a little better understanding of what she thinks, because you can look at her Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts, and others, and it turns out that, as Thomas Gallatin referred to, it turns out she's a pretty fairly rabid leftist. Here's just a couple of things she tweeted. The most dangerous entry to this country was the orange fascists we let into the White House. Okay, that's her assessment of Donald Trump. She, of course, has been a supporter of Bernie Sanders and is very opinionated on all sorts of kind of hot-button left-wing issues. You have other social media posts with statements like climate change is the biggest threat facing us all, something we just talked about a minute ago. And then her anger over flag burning was white privilege at its finest. And, of course, she was motivated in large part by kind of her anti-Trump ideas and values. And so certainly this. And also, it's fairly clear that she might have wanted to, if she could, join with what's called the resistance. Of course, this particular case will involve her in some kind of prosecution. She could face up to 10 years in prison. So we'll see whether or not Miss Winner is really a winner. And if nothing else, she is one of those individuals more recently who has leaked top secret information. The real question I think we have is, what about those who leaked previously and those who unmasked previously? Those are the investigations that still need to go forward and are perhaps even more important than these. So when you read about this, it's not like, well, we've gotten to the bottom of this. No, we've got an individual that since this time on, again, the date that was alleged is May 9th. So these are not the kinds of things that were happening during the campaign or even leading up to the inauguration of President Trump. These are some things that have happened more recently. But nevertheless, I think, as I've said on this program many times before, all you have to do is prosecute one or two leakers, and that sends a message that leaking is probably not a career-advancing idea and probably would end a lot of the problems with the leaks that we have up until right now. Let's take a break, though. I've got a number of you that would like to join the conversation, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. 1-800 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and not only talk about the leaking of some of the top secret information, but we're in the month of Ramadan, and this has been traditionally over the last couple of years perhaps the most dangerous month for individuals that have been identified as infidels. That would be you and me. So we're going to spend some time talking about those issues, and we'll certainly take your phone calls. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talked about religious freedom in the military. We've talked about leaking top secret information. We've talked about the whole issue of climate change. And so those are many of the issues that we'll take some phone calls on right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Well, the numbers are out, and they don't look good. According to the Pew Research Center, for the first time in 3 years, worldwide hostility to religion increased in the year 2015. Between 2014 and 2015, those countries marked with high or very high levels of government restrictions, actual government policies and activity restricting the free exercise of religion of its people, grew a full percentage point. During that same period, social hostilities increased 4%. Social hostilities are acts of religious hostility by private individuals, organizations, or groups in society. So even if the government was not hostile in terms of official policy, the private actions of its people grew significantly. Looking at the big picture, whether it's government policies or private individuals, 40% of the countries across the globe are hostile to religion. That means that the world is inching closer to a majority of countries demonstrating hostility towards religion. Of course, we can be immediately thankful for the great many protections we possess as Americans, but let us not be lulled into thinking that our experiment in liberty is the historical norm. Religious freedom is not something passed on from one generation to another by virtue of our DNA. It requires every generation to renew its commitment to liberty, and especially religious liberty, both here and abroad. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Take some phone calls in just a minute. But again, we're going to put some issues on the table here so that we can kind of educate you about what is taking place. And we'll get to some of those phone calls as soon as we get those processed. And again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention, too, that one of the things we oftentimes do is post various articles. The first one that we mentioned that had to do with the issue of climate is socially constructed is one that we have posted, and so that is there. We're going to be talking in just a few minutes with, again, the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, Dr. Everett Piper, his article there. This is a daycare. This is not a daycare. It's a university, And then the piece we're going to be doing with Dr. J. Richards, Early Church Was Not Communist. So we've got a couple of issues for you right there. And as soon as we can get these processed, we'll take some of your phone calls to give you a chance to join their conversation today. 1-800-351-1212. Let me also mention that we are in the midst of Ramadan, which, again, as we pointed out yesterday, is kind of interesting because we have seen so much violence. Last year, for example, I mentioned that during the 9th lunar month of the Islamic calendar, Ramadan, we ended up with 421 dead and 729 wounded. And so this is a concern that we may end up with statistics that will be equally grim like this year. And so that's one of those issues we want to talk about. And in just a few minutes, I'll spend some time trying to talk about why that is the case. But let me take some phone calls first, now that we've got some of those processed. And that is Ricky. Thank you for joining us today here, calling in from Louisiana.
Thank you, Kerby. Yeah, I just want to know about the Miss Sterling case yesterday that the court ruled against it. Who was the fifth judge? I guess that was Kerby, right?
Well, that is the question that I have, because if you work your way through this, it seems like getting 4 justices would be really easy. Let's just start from the ones we know. Neil Gorsuch, newly on the court. I'm sure he would take the case. Samuel Alito, I'm sure he would take the case. Clarence Thomas, I'm sure he would take the case. Well, there's 3. You only need a 4th one. And so, assuming I'm right with those 3, then that means that Justice Roberts didn't rule to want to take the case. Justice Kennedy didn't want to take the case. And then the 4 liberals, which would be Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Elena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor, did not want to take the case. I can come up with 3 or 4 different ways in which you could have 4 or 5 or 6 that would take the case. And since the case was not accepted, that means you only had 3 out of the 9 that took it. And so I'm pretty sure, although we're guessing because they do not reveal that, I'm guessing that probably Neil Gorsuch, Samuel Alito, and Clarence Thomas are the ones that voted to take the case, but they needed at least one more individual, either Justice John Roberts or Justice Anthony Kennedy or somebody to take the case. Didn't happen. So that's where we find ourselves.
So they don't reveal who didn't want to take the case then?
Not that I know of. If I find that out from Kelly Shackelford or somebody, maybe on the inside they can find out something, I'll let you know. But it is disturbing because, as I said, it only takes 4 to take a case, 5 to win. I could come up with all sorts of variations, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who in an earlier case in the 1980s seemed to be favorable to these kinds of cases. Of course, the one that she was favorable to involved a Jewish individual who later wrote a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal and is now a rabbi. But still, you would think that this one wouldn't have been that difficult for the Supreme Court to take, but they didn't. So that's all I know at the moment.
Yeah, that's okay. But can they go back and redo the case later on if they decide?
Yeah, there may be something else you could do with a different complexion of the Supreme Court or something like that. We'll have to see. But we'll get our First Liberty people in here. But just since so many of you wanted to know about it before I could even get them in studio here, I just thought I'd tell you because it came down yesterday, and I thought I'd let you know.
Okay, thanks, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ricky. Let's go to South Carolina this time. WAGP and Bruce. I think you've served in the Marine Corps. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. It was a blessing and a privilege. Thank you for taking my call. One quick question and a comment. What is the perspective or worldview of this officer who brought the charges, who did not like the Bible verse being placed in her cubicle? And I would say the comment I would say is that she is imposing her worldview without letting Monifa have her worldview.
Well said.
And that's basically all I have to say.
Yeah, I think it is. First of all, thank you for your service in the Marine Corps. And I think, here is a good example of an individual that did not do anything that would violate protocol, certainly did not disobey an order, but simply wanted to have a verse that would be inspiring on her computer. Now, you think of all the other things that people post in the various barracks and various cubicles and offices. It had to be somewhat of an animus towards religion. Don't know that for a fact, but it's certainly one possibility. And again, the story wasn't so much what happened to her as the fact that they went to the Navy Marine Court of Appeals and lost, and then they took it to the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, which is essentially the Supreme Court of the Armed Forces, and the highest military court ruled against her last August. So the only last hope was to bring it to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court deciding not to decide, I kind of put it in that situation. And for those of you that do serve in the military or have individuals that serve in the military, a source of real concern, if nothing else. So this is why I wanted to bring it to you, and we'll certainly get a full coverage and think through some of the issues. But as I said before, if you were even just counting the 4 conservatives on the court, that would be Thomas, Alito, Roberts, and Gorsuch. There's 4 right there. A person that on religious liberties usually votes for them, that would be Kennedy. There's 5. And as I pointed out, Ruth Bader Ginsburg on more than one occasion seems to have been sympathetic to some of these issues of religious liberty, especially when it involves, personally deeply felt beliefs. You could easily have come up with 6 or more that might have wanted to take the case. It only takes 4 to take, but it couldn't get 4. So that's what we know so far. Let me, just before we take a break, we're going to get into some other issues. Just finish my point about Ramadan. A lot of people said, why is it at a time when Muslims are supposed to fast from their first day of prayer, first prayer of the day at dawn, all the way to their 4th prayer after sunset, a time when they're supposed to have the most fervent prayer, that this has also become such a violent month? And it was last year. It is certainly going to be this year in light of all the things that have been happening in Manila and in Egypt and in Baghdad and Kabul and in London and all. We just go down the long, long list. And Jim Dennison reminded us that there's a quote from Muhammad who says, "Whoever performs an obligatory deed in this month shall receive the reward of performing 7 obligations at any other time." That's why, for example, a Taliban spokesman said, our fight right now means that any act of worship, and jihad is seen as them as worship, will receive 70 times their reward. So for some of these individuals, you can certainly see that they believe that their greatest chance for some kind of reward after this life might come if they were to engage in a violent jihad during the month of Ramadan. So now we're coming to realize that this holy month of Ramadan, the 9th lunar month in the Islamic calendar, may be the most dangerous time in the year for individuals that have terrorists in their midst. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about that and certainly encourage you to be in prayer during this particular time as well. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking first with Dr. Everett Piper about some of these issues on college campus, and then we'll be talking with Jay Richards about the early church. All that coming up right after this.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today. In just a minute, we're going to be talking with Dr. Everett Piper about some of his commentaries, which we have posted on our website, pointofview.net. But we have at least one call left over from the last hour as we talked about the decision by the Supreme Court not to hear the case of Lance Corporal Monifa Sterling, court-martialed for having an inspirational Bible verse, that is one from Isaiah 54:17. This verse particularly said, "No weapon formed against me shall prosper." And I wanted to at least take one more phone call on that. We'll take some more later on in the hour. But, William, I understand you served in the military as well. So, first of all, thank you for your service. And what would you like to add to our conversation?
Hi, my name is William, and I'm calling from Bethesda, Maryland. And I served in the military for 22 years. And the first part of warrior is war. So the first thing we do is we start to train to follow orders, to do what is right all the time. All we can really do is do our duty. It's almost like being a centurion in the Roman army. You do your duty.
Well, and again, like I said, I understand when you go into the military, you give up some of your rights. But the real question that was going to be for the Supreme Court, I wish they considered it, is would the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which did not exist back when Ruth Bader Ginsburg had that particular case we were talking about, but it does now exist, would that apply at all to an individual in the military? But again, the Supreme Court decided not to decide, so basically the ruling from the Court of Appeals for Armed Forces is probably going to be the one that will be normative. But William, thank you for your service. And again, it's just a reminder that when you go to war and you go in the military, you go as a warrior, and you are to obey orders. So thank you so very much for calling in today. We'll take some more calls on that issue because I know many of you'd like to comment about the decision by the Supreme Court not to hear that particular case. But I wanted to also give you a chance to hear from Dr. Everett Piper. He's been on the program with us before, serves as the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, a graduate of Spring Arbor University, Bowling Green University, with a PhD from Michigan State University. We've posted a number of his comments and commentaries. Matter of fact, I did a commentary a while back on one of his on the birth of free speech. We've posted this latest one. This is not a daycare, it's a university. And Dr. Piper, always great to have you on the program with us.
Kerby, thank you so much. I'm honored to join you.
Let's, if we can, talk about this because this one really caused me to roll my eyes a little bit. On Wednesdays, tomorrow we'll even have this, we have a Millennial Roundtable. And so we have Nick Pitts, who's with the Denison Forum. We have Allie Beth Stuckey, who's on the various things that are various Fox News outlets and things of that nature. But you said in this particular column that after a chapel service, you had a student come up and complain that he felt, quote, victimized by a sermon on 1 Corinthians 13. If we didn't know you more, we'd think, he's got to be making this up. Tell us a little bit more.
Exactly, and I'm not making it up. That indeed is true. Oklahoma Wesleyan is a Christian university, unapologetically so. Nobody enrolls here without knowing that. We're conservative, we're Christian, we're proud of it. Our attitude is we're going to tell you exactly who we are, and if you like it, come here. If you don't, you probably should go someplace else because it's not going to change. So all of our students know that we stand boldly and unapologetically on the truths of Christ and the truth of Scripture. In a required chapel service that was on 1 Corinthians 13, the quintessential love chapter of the Bible, we actually had a student come forward afterward and say that he felt victimized by the sermon and that he, quote unquote, was singled out as well as his peers. I was incredulous, as you know. I decided that my weekly op-ed in the local newspaper should cover this story. And I essentially said, you know that feeling of discomfort you had when you heard that sermon about love? It's called your conscience. You might want to attend to it.
Yes.
And if you expect us to coddle you rather than confront you when you feel guilty for not being loving enough, then you're in the wrong place. Oklahoma Wesleyan is not a safe place per se. It's a place where you're supposed to come and be challenged, where you should learn, where you should grow up. This is a university, my goodness. It's not a daycare. And as you know, that particular piece caught fire. It's caused a bit of a grass fire in terms of the conversation that's taken place about safe spaces and trigger warnings and microaggressions and what's been dubbed the snowflake rebellion on so many of our campuses.
Well, again, like you point out, the Christian campus, even more so, is there to really challenge you, because that's really what we're taught. We're challenging people to go into the ministry. We're challenging people to go in missions. We're, in some respects, you should go to chapel, expect to be challenged. But even on the secular university, where we have much more pluralism, you still are expected to be able to grapple with different kinds of views. And yet what we've seen today, Dr. Piper, is this idea that I don't want to hear views that are hostile to my perspective. They might hurt my feelings. These would be those trigger warnings, and I need to get some hot chocolate in some safe spaces. And so it's bad enough that it's been happening on the secular university. It really got my attention when it was happening on yours, which is obviously a very well-known Christian university.
And I want to be clear, this is not pervasive on my campus. This is an isolated incident.
Sure.
And in fact, probably 95% of my students are chuckling at this story because they recognize the silliness of this student actually coming forward and expecting a trigger warning to be issued before an altar call, per se, is really what he's expecting. That doesn't happen. I'm not going to issue a trigger warning before the pastor gets up and asks you to confess your sins. Of course you're going to feel uncomfortable. That's the point. That's part of what Christianity calls us to do, is to repent, not feel comfortable and stagnant in our sin, but actually look in the mirror, recognize that the problem is staring back at us. It's not other people, it's ourselves. That's part of the Christian message, is confession and redemption and transformation and change. And if we're never made to feel uncomfortable in life, then none of that happens. I don't know about you, Kerby. I've never grown a bit in my life until someone made me feel uncomfortable by actually challenging me. The old sports axiom, if you will, no pain, no gain. Well, isn't that true in the academy also?
I think so. That's a good point. When we come back from the break in just a few minutes, I want to get into some of these other issues. Of course, your piece on the birth of free speech and even the whole issue of reverse racism and what's happening up there in Evergreen. But you mentioned that this created a little bit of a grass fire. Can you share with us for about a minute or so what has been the reaction to some of this?
We've had 3.5 million views that we're aware of that piece. 3.5 million. We did an internal statistical analysis on the comments. 97% of the comments were positive, 3% were negative. Now, the interesting thing, and I'll be brief here because I know you need a break, of the 3% that were negative, many of them were from the church with a capital C, not the culture. It was the secularist, the atheist, the agnostic that emailed me or texted me and said, thank you. It was the Christian, if you will, at another Christian university or whatnot that emailed or texted me and said, shame on you. So the secular world is saying thanks. The Christian is saying, I don't like what you said.
Yeah, don't want to hurt your feelings. Let's take a break. When we come back, we are privileged to have with us for just a few more minutes Dr. Everett Piper and a couple of issues. Of course, we talked about his piece before about the birth of free speech, which again gets us into a conversation about what's happening at University of California at Berkeley. Of course, a lot of us have been following what happens and has been happening up there at Evergreen State College, and even a piece the other day where one of the professors, who, by the way, calls himself liberal and progressive, said, the campus mob came for me, and you, professor, could be next. He was completely blindsided by some of that, so we'll talk about that with Dr. Everett Piper right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Andrew McCarthy begins his commentary with these words. During the Obama years, the National Security Agency intentionally and routinely intercepted and reviewed communications of American citizens in violation of the Constitution and of court-ordered guidelines implemented pursuant to federal law. This claim is backed up by a FISA court opinion and investigative research that had been done over the last 5 months. There are two problems. The first is incidental collection of data from Americans that occurs when intelligence agencies target one suspect and pick up information from an American citizen. But that is a small problem compared to what is called upstream collection of information. Andrew McCarthy explains that it is not possible to capture a single email related to a single target, so the NSA must capture packets of email data, which includes lots of emails besides the targeted email. That means your communications are being seized and subjected to inspection without any warrant or probable cause. Now, you might think this isn't a problem since you aren't calling or writing to anyone who would be a potential terrorist or criminal suspect, but that doesn't mean that your communication won't be accessed and analyzed. Not only do the intelligence agencies look for communication to and from a target, they also look for communication about a target. Again, this is done without a warrant or probable cause. You know, I can remember telling my radio listeners during the years when President Bush was in office not to be concerned about intelligence agencies listening to your phone calls or reading your emails. I assured them that they were looking for terrorists and criminals and would not be monitoring your communications. Well, it turns out that at least during the Obama administration, that illegal surveillance has been taking place. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Dr. Everett Piper with us. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. President of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. If you'd like to know more about that university or talk about getting a campus tour, we have information about that on our website, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. We have posted his piece, This is Not a Daycare, It's a University. But let's talk about the broader issue. You've talked about this in one of your other commentaries on the birth of free speech, but I know you're really concerned right now about the lack of leadership on some of the colleges and universities. And in some respects now, it's almost like the students are running the campus. You can go to Middlebury College in Vermont. You can go to Claremont McKinney College in California. Of course, you can go to UC Berkeley. And then, of course, the most recent one, Evergreen State College. What are your thoughts? As a university professor, you might be very concerned about the fact that in some respects the administration is coddling some of the students and in some respects letting the students run the university and establish all the norms that need to take place.
We, meaning my industry, the American Academy, the college and university with a capital C and capital U, we have created this monster. It's turning around to bite us. Richard Weaver told us in his seminal work in 1948 that was titled Ideas Have Consequences, that ideas have consequences. And after teaching 30, 40, 50 years of self-absorption and narcissism, somehow we're surprised to find a self-absorbed and narcissistic student body. It's turning around and it's biting us. It's biting the hand that fed it. And the reason for that is we have dishonored and we have completely lost what it means to be a liberal arts institution. The word liberal classically means liberty and liberation and freedom and justice. And that's why the liberal arts institution was founded some 1,000 years ago in Oxford, let's say, to educate a free man and a woman, a free people, a free society, a free culture, a free church, a free company, a free country. And what we have right now is the antithesis of classical liberalism prevailing on our college campuses. It's ideological fascism. It isn't academic freedom. Because if you don't comply, if you aren't one of the fascists, if you're not part of the bundle that's commonly held together in total unity and conformity, if you dare to dissent, if you dare to disagree, the fascist will crush you. And that is ideological fascism, not academic freedom. And Berkeley, of all places, the quote-unquote birthplace of the free speech movement, to be raising the angry fist with a red face of fascism to sequester and to silence any dissenting view. Berkeley isn't the birthplace of free speech. Bethlehem is, because that's where we get the words of Jesus Christ ultimately, that you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
And again, in your commentary, you say that human freedom, intellectual or otherwise, was not born in Berkeley, California, but rather in a community called Bethlehem some 2,000 years ago. And Dr. Piper, if you think about that, I mean, the model for Harvard, for example, Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae, truth for Christ in the church, and you can go all the way through almost 200 years of the founding of major universities. They were founded on some kind of Christian assumption. But even if you reject that, still the idea that up until fairly recently, when I would speak on college campuses, I'd have a professor say, okay, have you had a chance to hear my point of view? And I disagree with Mr. Anderson, but I'm going to give him a chance to express his point of view in the classroom. That was typical until about the 1980s or 1990s. And then you had this idea of political correctness, and certain ideas not only are wrong, but they're evil. They don't deserve an opportunity to be expressed. And so in some respects, that's why we've created this, because we have a whole generation saying we don't even want to hear what Charles Murray has to say at Middlebury College. We don't want to even hear what Heather McDonald has to say at Claremont McKenna College. And those are academically qualified individuals that we've even had on this radio program.
And the reason for that is none of that liberty, none of that classical liberalism that you just referred to, that we've enjoyed as a culture and as a community and as a country for some 200 years, none of that can exist outside the context of what G.K. Chesterton defined as the as the fences that give us freedom. Mm-hmm. Chesterton told us, if you want freedom, you better build a fence. He also said, if you want liberty, you better acknowledge that there's law. In fact, he said, if you get rid of the big laws of God, you don't get liberty. You get thousands of little laws that rush in to fill the vacuum. And what he's telling us is the paradox of discipline and freedom, that you have no freedom without discipline. And we know this in life. You can't play a sport unless you discipline yourself to play it within the boundaries and to listen to the referee. You can't perform music. You can't play a concerto. It'll be chaos if you don't understand the rhyme, the rhythm, the cadence, the laws of music. It's the paradox of discipline and freedom. And that comes from the Judeo-Christian ethic. And when we digress to the point where it's about power rather than principles, it's about people and power and politics and the podium and the pulpit, when truth is subjugated to those things and becomes subservient to those things, when we lose the context of truth, there is no freedom. Again, back to the words of Christ, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Not your opinion, not power, not politics, but truth. That's why my book that's coming out in just a few weeks, Not a Daycare, The Devastating Consequences of Losing Truth, is so important, because it highlights the fact that we're sawing off the very branch upon which we sit.
I'd like to have a whole hour with you when that book comes out, so let's see if we can book that soon. But one other issue I did want to put on the table, one that you've also written about, and that is where you have minority student versus white student, and we're starting to see that play out in places like Evergreen State College. I mentioned this one individual who was a biology professor, who was very liberal, by the way, but his crime, if you will, is that he objected to this idea of the planned day of absence, in which it used to be the black students would leave. Now they wanted all the white students to leave. And he said, no, let's stay together. And by saying that alone, he was unprepared for the firestorm, the call for him to be fired, and the fact that he had to hold his biology class in a local park because he was so fearful for what kind of violence might break out. Your thoughts?
It's called a university for a reason. It's not called a diversity. This is Oklahoma Wesleyan University. It is not Oklahoma Wesleyan diversity. We believe in the unity of truth. We don't believe in division, and dissension. People should come together recognizing truth with a capital T as the glue that binds together a free people. We don't believe in cutting a baby in half because when you do, it's dead. It doesn't exist. Solomon told us that a living thing that is severed is a dead thing, and it has no value. This is a university. It is not a diversity. We need to reclaim the high ground of defining our words in the academic and the social debate today. There was a time, Kerby, when words meant something. Words like green and gay and left and right and up and down and truthhood and falsehood. There was a time when male and female meant something. My land, we live in a day where we can't even acknowledge that a female is an objective fact. We've dumbed down the definition of the woman to nothing but a fabrication and a fantasy. A female is nothing but a leprechaun and a unicorn. It's a make-believe thing today rather than an objective reality. And I'm the one who's being accused of being anti-science? This is lunacy. It's lunacy. I actually teach biology and physiology at Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and I will not be so misogynistic as to suggest that a woman isn't real.
That's amazing. Let me just mention real quickly before I let you go that, again, we have a link to Oklahoma Wesleyan University. It's okwu.edu, but we have a link there as well, and you can find out a lot more about the various schools of business, arts and science, ministry and Christian thought, education, nursing, even the graduate program there. And if people would like to know a little bit more about that, they can write to you, and if they'd like to get a tour of the campus, I'm sure you'd be glad to show them around, wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter. It's Dr. Everett Piper. That's DREVERETTPIPER. And like you said, Oklahoma Wesleyan is okwu.edu. My book is Not a Daycare, The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth, and it'll be out in about 3 to 4 weeks with Regnery. You can get it on Amazon.
And we'd love to have you on. And I might just mention next to his picture is both his Twitter account and his Facebook account, so you can find all of that there as well. Dr. Piper, always great to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
Thank you, and blessings, Kerby.
Let me take one last phone call here real quickly. Ken in Georgia, I think you wanted to add something to our conversation. What would you like to say?
Well, after listening to all that from Mr. Piper, I would like to praise and take off my hat to his reasserting a different definition of what it is to be liberal than the one that is flippantly thrown around so much, which, by the way, is used to cut people off and drown people out, even among Christians, because they say something that people disagree with. But in addition, I would say that in praise of wisdom, there is a lack of wisdom, and the military needs wisdom. They may think that they're not doing anything spiritual or that they don't need wisdom just to do duty, but there is a critical need for
wisdom. Yeah, we need to take a break, but let's be praying for those in the military. We'll take a break, and we'll come back and talk with Jay Richards right after this.
Sarita is a Point of View listener in Georgia, someone probably a lot like you. Listening to your program, she writes, has helped me realize that I do have the power to conduct change in my area and this nation. And with all of the online tools you provide, this power has become even more apparent to me. What can one person do? A whole lot, says Sarita. And then she says, and together we can get even more done. She's right. Sarita is right. This is a moment of opportunity, and together with you, Point of View is looking to accomplish a lot. This program and those online tools she mentioned will only continue being available if we hear from people like you this week. Join Truth Team 360. There are many levels. Check them out. Choose the size of the part you can play at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We put lots of issues on the table, but I thought we'd put one more. We've talked about what's happening on university campuses and trigger warnings and safe spaces, and had a chance to hear from Dr. Everett Piper about this is not a daycare, it's a university. We've talked about the Supreme Court decision not to hear the case involving the military and a variety of other issues, including the climate accords. But we thought just because Sunday was Pentecost, it was an opportunity to think about, is it possible that after Pentecost, communist or socialist? Because you've heard so many times arguments, people saying, well, they held all of their possessions in common, so isn't that an argument for socialism or even communism? This is a question that Dr. Jay Richards has approached many times before because he has written a number of different books in everything from science, including The Privileged Planet, to a number in the area of economics, holds a PhD and is also the executive editor of The Stream. We, of course, had John Smirek on before with The Stream as well, serving as the senior editor. And he's currently is the assistant professor research professor in the School of Business and Economics at Catholic University. So, Dr. Jay Richards, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Great to be with you, Kerby.
It's always great to see you. I saw pictures of you and Jenny and others the other day at graduation, so I thought it would be good to have you on the program. You have heard this so often, but it's worth going through again because as you write and teach about Christianity and economics, you oftentimes have individuals say, well, when I look at the book of Acts, it looks like right after Pentecost, the individuals in the church sold their belongings, they shared their wealth. Mm-hmm. Sure sounds a lot like communism. So how do you answer that question?
Well, first of all, they're exactly right. That's what the text says. You got to sort of picture the scene here. There were really the only church insofar as there's a church to speak of was really the apostles that were left, and Mary Magdalene and Mary, and then Peter starts preaching at Pentecost, and thousands of people become Christians all at once. And it says in Acts 4 that the Christians that were there began selling their stuff and sharing. And so all that's true. All that's exactly right. The problem is as you noted, people very quickly think, okay, well, that isn't that what communism or socialism is? Socialism is just where you sell all your stuff and you share it amongst each other. And this is one of these situations where it pays both to define terms very carefully and, frankly, to read the Bible really carefully. And this idea comes, I think, from failing to do both of those things. So the first thing I always tell people is let's define what communism is. Communism doesn't mean sharing your stuff with other people. That's always been a part of the Christian faith, and in fact, the idea of sharing is a sort of universally held virtue. That's not what we're talking about. When you talk about communism, at least in a modern sense, it descends from Karl Marx's theory of communism, which argued that the economy would reach a stage that he called capitalism, in which there was strong sort of industrial power in cities and all the wealth would be held by the capitalists. And then you'd get a socialist revolution. The workers would violently confiscate the property or the so-called means of production. And then the state would own everything on behalf of the people for a while. And then you'd get a new socialist man would emerge and the state would wither away. And then you'd get a communist utopia. That was, of course, how that theory was supposed to go. None of that ever actually happened. If you look at the communist experience of the 20th century, every time it was tried, they got stuck in that socialist stage with the government owning everything. But just that enough is, I think, enough to say, now compare that with what was happening in the church in Acts. Roman centurions are not knocking down people's doors and taking their stuff, right? They're not collectivizing farms and all these kinds of things that you'd expect, certainly in socialism or communism. None of that's happening. This is a voluntary act of at this time, a small group of Christians filled with the Holy Spirit sharing voluntarily amongst themselves. And so I think that's the first most important thing for Christians that have thought about this and are asked about this is just to say, look, Christians sharing amongst themselves is not communism. It's a sharing, and it is what it is. And biblical scholars almost overwhelmingly agree to this point. And so, Kerby, the problem is that we tend not to look at the text carefully. And then I think the second thing to say is that even given the details of the small church in Jerusalem, it was never held up as a model for how other churches were supposed to respond. It's easy not to notice the unique details that were happening here in Jerusalem. So you had Pentecost, of course, it's a Jewish festival, so you have thousands of Jews that have descended upon the city of Jerusalem from around the Roman world. So you can picture thousands of people staying in inns, staying with family members. They're away from their families, from their jobs, from their livelihoods. And then suddenly some subsection of these Jews that are away from home become Christians. And so what we have in the early chapters of Acts is basically the locals, the people that lived in Jerusalem and those areas that had some private property, decided, okay, in this emergency situation, we have these new brothers and sisters in Christ. They sort of had two alternatives. Either all of those new Christians would have to go back by themselves to the places of origin, or stay there for a while and to sort of build a community. So that's what happened. And so I think the Holy Spirit led those who had the means to then sell voluntarily their possessions and to share amongst them with their new brothers and sisters. But if you, of course, look at the other chapters or the other books in the New Testament, Paul's letter to Thessalonica or his letters to the church at Corinth, this is never held up as a sort of way in which individual congregations ought to orient themselves. In fact, there's no evidence of that. And so I think what we have at the beginning of the book of Acts is really just a description of a kind of an emergency situation. And it gives us guidance as Christians about, okay, well, in a pinch, this is the sort of thing that we ought to be willing to do. But the idea that this is a primitive experiment in communism, I think it fails both on the details and also just on the definition of communism.
And again, you see that Paul's taking up a collection in Macedonia, and he's also writing in 2 Corinthians for the church to continue that, to help those in Jerusalem because of that circumstance. You also point out the fact that if you look at what he says to the church in Thessalonica, you have a situation which says, if one will not work, let him not eat. For we hear that some of you are living in idleness, mere busybodies not doing any work. That sounds a little bit like the Pilgrim experiment, which William Bradford figured we needed to get rid of because some people were just sitting around and expecting everybody else to do the work.
That's exactly right. I mean, this kind of experiment has been tried throughout history. And as you mentioned, Bradford, and this kind of the early Pilgrim experiment, the idea was that they were going to hold the farms in common. And it turns out this was kind of an agreement they made with the investor that paid for the expedition, essentially. But they figured out after just a season that, when we hold all the farms in common, nobody really has an incentive to work because they don't see the fruits of their own labor. And it was actually a catastrophe. And so Bradford then quickly learned the lesson and said, okay, we're going to actually hold these as individual family plots of land. And then everything changed entirely. In fact, I think they would probably all have died of starvation if they had maintained that kind of communal experience. And of course, there are groups that voluntarily live a communal existence, but the ones that succeed are always, first of all, it's always voluntary, they're always very small, and they're a deeply committed group of people. So it's never a situation in which this kind of communal existence is being imposed from the top down. We have the evidence of history in the 20th century overwhelmingly shows you that, it's what happens is just what happened in the case of William Bradford and the Pilgrims, and what apparently happened in Thessalonica is that people, a lot of people, unfortunately, this is fallen human nature. If you can get something without working, a lot of us will actually take that deal. And Paul was wise enough to realize that was even happening apparently in the young church at Thessalonica.
We need to take a break, but maybe when we come back, I thought we might also answer the other question that sometimes surfaces, and that is, well, wasn't Ananias and Sapphira condemned for not contributing to that? So that's certainly another issue we can put on the table. But as we go through this, I would really encourage some of you that if you have a young person that's headed off to college, even as we were talking about some of the things taught in the Christian colleges, this would be a very good piece to download, as well as some of the other great material by Jay Richards. And we, of course, have a link to his articles that are on the stream. This is one that you can find at the stream livestream.org. And this is, of course, just one that we're making available today, but many of the others that he's written about, politics disguised as science, when to doubt scientific consensus, as well as a variety of other issues when religious and economic freedoms stand and fall together. We have quite a number that you can find out about by simply clicking on that website, and we'll certainly give you that opportunity. Also, when we come back, let's, if we can, in this last few minutes, give you a chance if there is something we've talked about today that you'd like to respond to. 1-800-351-1212. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we have our Millennial Roundtable tomorrow. We'll get back into some of these issues of trigger warnings and safe spaces, and we've posted a couple of very good articles on that. Then on Thursday, going to have a chance to hear from everybody from John Stone Street to Gary Bowers to Robert Knight, and then Friday, of course, our weekend edition. So lots coming up. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Jay Richards right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Well, the numbers are out, and they don't look good. According to the Pew Research Center, for the first time in 3 years, worldwide hostility to religion increased in the year 2015. Between 2014 and 2015, those countries marked with high or very high levels of government restrictions, actual government policies and activity restricting the free exercise of religion of its people, grew a full percentage point. During that same period, social hostilities increased 4%. Social hostilities are acts of religious hostility by private individuals, organizations, or groups in society. So even if the government was not hostile in terms of official policy, the private actions of its people grew significantly. Looking at the big picture, whether it's government policies or private individuals, 40% of the countries across the globe are hostile to religion. That means that the world is inching closer to a majority of countries demonstrating hostility towards religion. Of course, we can be immediately thankful for the great many protections we possess as Americans, but let us not be lulled into thinking that our experiment in liberty is the historical norm. Religious freedom is not something passed on from one generation to another by virtue of our DNA. It requires every generation to renew its commitment to liberty, and especially religious liberty, both here and abroad. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Jay Richards with us for just a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Jay, one of the other questions that people have is if you look at Acts 5, you see that Peter condemns Ananias and Sapphira because they sold their land, kept some back, and the proceeds were given. So some people say, well, there's a good example about the fact that this was maybe not voluntary, but compulsive. So how do you respond to that?
Well, again, Kerby, what's funny about it is people just read the text carefully, it's clear that something completely different is going on. And Peter, it's quite a frightful text. I mean, honestly, Peter speaks to this couple, and then they're actually struck dead. And so it's really quite dramatic. But Peter quite explicitly says, even after you sold these things, were they not yours? So in other words, he endorses the idea that you have a right to private property. It was legitimately yours. They sinned, and they were struck dead because they sinned against the Holy Spirit. So the issue there really didn't have anything to do with how much they were obligated to sell or to give to the church. The problem is that they sold some property, and then they gave only part of the proceeds while claiming to give all the proceeds. So they were quite explicitly really lying to, as Peter interpreted, lying directly to the Holy Spirit, and that's, of course, that's a very serious sin. And certainly, I would imagine the example must have been quite striking to these new Christians in Jerusalem, but it provides absolutely no evidence for the idea that they were all under some kind of compulsory moral obligation to sell everything and give it away. Again, Peter himself says that. And a lot of these kinds of things, Kerby, I mean, this is one of these questions that I decided to write on because I get asked this question almost every time I talk about the Bible and free enterprise or capitalism and Christianity. People just kind of have this vague recollection of these chapters in Acts, but don't actually bother to go read the text themselves. And what's amazing is if you just spend 20 minutes studying the text carefully, it all falls away and it's quite clear what's going on. But for some reason, socialism and bad ideas about economics, they just have a way of sticking in our minds. And just because we're Christians doesn't mean that we're immune to these ideas. And in fact, I think as Christians, precisely because we're compassionate, and ought to be compassionate about the poor, we sometimes allow our emotional feelings to get in the way of thinking really clearly about how best to actually help people. And so that's why I spend so much of my time speaking on Christian college campuses, including very conservative college campuses. And I tell your listeners, like it or not, the same kind of confusions that we're hearing about in some of these secular schools, they're alive and well in a lot of Christian schools as well, maybe in a slightly different form. But we're not immune to these ideas and these errors, unfortunately.
I might mention that your book, probably one that I would want to put in the hands of any young person going off to college, Money, Greed, and God, Why Capitalism is the Solution, Not the Problem. And, back to this idea that here Peter says that it was not this your property. And whether it's in the Old Testament, even the whole idea of thou shalt not steal emphasizes this idea of private property. And certainly in the New Testament, you have this idea of private property. And if you have private property, then you need to be able to have the freedom to exchange private property rights with other individuals, which would imply a free market. So, if anything, the Bible endorses the idea of a free market, not socialism or capitalism. True?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, the Bible's not an economic textbook. Nobody's saying that. But if you look just at what's presupposed, the idea of private property itself, as you mentioned, I mean, really 2 of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's stuff, essentially, both presuppose that people have a right to certain possessions that is rightfully theirs and ought not to be taken away from them. So it's everywhere in the background. Something I always notice thinking about these issues, if you read the book of Genesis, 50 chapters, starts with the creation of the universe, and it ends with Joseph and his brothers in Egypt. A whole lot of detail covered in this one book, and yet one entire chapter is devoted to basically a land deal between Abraham and some Hittites. Abraham's looking for some property to bury Sarah, his deceased wife. And you get in that one chapter really the kind of rudiments of property and titling as we enjoy in modern 21st century America. And so this idea of private property, of exchange, it's everywhere presupposed in Scripture. So even though, the Bible's not an economics textbook, but certainly if you're going to tease out what the economic implications of Scripture are, it's much more free enterprise or economic freedom or whatever you want to call it.
Let me just mention for just a minute, since you did say that you go speak, I know that, of course, you are busy enough at Catholic University teaching about economics and business, but if people would like to contact you or like to have you come and speak either to their group or to a church or to a particular Christian university or something like that, how is that possible?
In fact, if somebody's interested in doing that, they can actually, if they'll send an email, either as a stream to the general website, or people can actually write me at Catholic University. I'm on the faculty page. They're interested in having me come speak. I do, you know, Kerby, is sort of what I focus on, is the intersection of economics and theology. And there was a time in the 1990s when I honestly thought this is sort of a dead issue. Everybody knows that markets work and that, communism doesn't work. But unfortunately, there are now kids in college, there are people voting that don't even remember the Cold War. And so these ideas and these arguments have to be made anew to every generation.
So again, let me just encourage you to find out a little bit more about Jay Richards. And of course, we've mentioned the book that he co-authored with James Robison, Indivisible. I mentioned Money, Greed, and God, and certainly that was a book that was a winner of the Templeton Enterprise Award. Of course, Privileged Planet, I just mentioned in passing, which he wrote with Guillermo Gonzalez, which will tell you a little bit more about intelligent design. And it's always fun to have somebody that, like I, can speak on science and government and policy and all those issues. And we used to teach together even on one of these cruises. We need to do that again with you and your wife. But if nothing else,
Absolutely.
It was great to catch up with you again. If you want to find some of the other articles by Jay Richards, we have the link there as well. And I would really encourage you to find out a little bit more about him. We also, next to his picture, also have a link to his Twitter account, his Facebook account, and we have some other resources that will take you to the stream. So, Jay, always great to have you on the program, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Thanks so much, Kerby.
Let's take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we're going to spend some time with our Millennial Roundtable. We have a couple of people around the roundtable. Actually, our regulars will be with us. Nick Pitts, Dr. Nicholas Pitts now, since he's got his doctorate, is back from Europe, and he will be in studio with us. Allie Beth Stuckey will be with us as well before she gets to go out on the blaze. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about a couple of those articles I mentioned that we are going to post. One by Bernard Goldberg, Cowards of the Academy, in which he's talking about what's been happening at Middlebury College, University of California at Berkeley, at Claremont McKenna College, and of course the big issue at Evergreen State College. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail tomorrow. And I'd love to have our Millennial Roundtable kind of address those issues. Then we have a piece by William McGurn, Why Elites Hate, talking about kind of the liberal contempt for America, especially for anybody that might have voted for President Trump. And then we have a piece by Senator Ben Sass. We need to get him back on again because this comes actually a lot of this from his book, but it's entitled What Happens When We Don't Raise Kids to Become Adults. And as he was asked to take over the university there, Midland University, he began to be very concerned about the fact that there wasn't much of a work ethic or even a reasonable expectation among the students. So I'm going to hear our comments from our Millennial Roundtable on that. And so those are a couple of issues we will talk about tomorrow right here on Point of View. Just before we go, let me encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. That's where you can find the 3 articles that we've been talking about here today. They're available to you. My Viewpoints commentary today on illegal surveillance. And of course, as you go there, I hope that you'll also click on that button that says Join the Truth Team. As we've talked about today, we're trying to rebuild truth in a post-truth culture. So anything you can do to help us would be greatly appreciated. I want to thank Andrew, Elisa, and all that have been involved in this program. We'll see you back here tomorrow for our Millennial Roundtable.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily, and